Everyday life in the Mission District of San Francisco moved along as usual, with neighbors going about their errands in the lively hum of the local market. The morning sun warmed the painted rooftops, and the familiar scent of fresh bread from the bakery drifted along Mission Street. People chatted outside the corner store, some flipping through avocados or apples, others just catching up on the neighborhood news. There was a sense that everyone here shared more than just sidewalks. It almost felt as if a common story ran quietly underneath daily life, some invisible thread linking the regulars together. Inside the market, in the produce aisle, Mrs. Dolores Hernandez, a woman well into her 70s, straightened her glasses and frowned at a row of oranges. Her face, lined with years and firm beliefs, showed a trace of impatience as she reached for a shopping bag. Dolores was the kind of person who rarely drew attention, preferring to move quietly through her routine. This morning, as she compared prices and mumbled about how things used to be, she seemed just another shopper lost in thought. But then, just as Dolores reached for a bunch of bananas, a sudden voice from behind and an unexpected gesture split through the calm, changing the rhythm of the whole day. A few steps down the aisle, Chris Thompson, a young man in his late 20s with a quiet presence and sharp eyes, made his way to the fruit display. He was juggling a basket and texting someone, trying not to bump into the tower of watermelons nearby. Chris had that easygoing manner neighbors appreciated, always polite, never in a rush to draw attention. Most days, you might have walked right past him and not remembered a thing about him later. But this morning, as he slid his phone into his jacket and reached for a few apples, his path accidentally crossed with Mrs. Hernandez's. Chris glanced up just as Dolores shifted to grab her bananas, and for a split second, their eyes met. It was nothing any outsider would call dramatic, but somehow there was a spark of tension that could not be ignored. Maybe it was the way Dolores bristled at being interrupted, or how Chris paused, sensing something unspoken in her stare. The others in the aisle seemed to feel it too. The usual laughter and small talk faded, as if people were instinctively waiting for what would happen next. The market's easy rhythm had been interrupted, and even the fruit in their baskets suddenly felt heavier, hinting that a simple morning would become something much more memorable. Without a pause, Dolores let out a sharp, cutting remark, her voice ringing louder than she probably intended. Her words, laced with prejudice, filled the space between the apples and oranges, hitting Chris and echoing all the way down the aisle. The whole thing happened so quickly that Chris barely had a moment to take in what she had actually said. For a few seconds, he just stood there, unsure if he should respond or simply walk away. Everyone nearby heard the comment. There was no way to pretend otherwise. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, shopping carts halted, and even the cashier, at the end of the aisle, looked up to see what was going on. Some people lowered their eyes, maybe hoping the moment would just pass, while others stared directly at Dolores and Chris, not believing what they had just witnessed. It was as if time itself had hit the brakes, the usual steady background of humming chatter replaced by a thick, awkward silence. In that uncomfortable stillness, nobody really knew what to do next. The breeze from the open door felt cold for the first time that day, and everyone seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see who would be the first to speak. Chris felt the sting of Dolores's words hit him, stiffening his posture for a moment. There was an instinct inside him to shoot back, maybe to defend himself or just match her tone, but instead, he paused. He took a slow breath and stared down at the fruit in his hand, as if searching for some answer in the smooth red skin of the apple. Another second passed, and the silence in the market grew even heavier. It would have been easy for him to let anger take over, and for a heartbeat, that temptation almost won. But Chris recognized the watching eyes of his neighbors. There was Mr. Lopez from the bakery, two young students clutching their grocery list, and even Mrs. Carter from across the hall, her mouth slightly open in shock. In that split second, Chris made the choice to not let someone else's bitterness decide who he was going to be. He exhaled, steadying himself, and glanced back up at Dolores, his face calm but not cold. Nobody said a word, but you could feel everyone waiting, almost on edge, to see what he would do next. The air in the market buzzed with unease, every tick of the clock stretching the moment out just a little longer. Dolores stayed where she was, standing as if rooted to the spot. She tightened her grip on her grocery bag, her chin slightly raised, and her eyes locked on Chris. Her posture was rigid and unyielding, and there was something almost expectant in the way she watched him, as though she was waiting for him to lose his temper or lash out. The sense of challenge was clear. Even if she never said another word, her body language spoke for her. The whole store seemed to freeze, as if everyone inside had silently agreed not to breathe until someone broke the tension. Off to the side, a young employee named Jamie, barely out of high school and still new to the store, stood by the end cap of potatoes. He shifted from foot to foot, unsure if he should step in, call for a manager, or just pretend to organize the bags of onions. Jamie glanced around and saw the faces of the shoppers, all struck by how quickly an ordinary morning had changed. Without meaning to, the customers became an audience, watching each move and waiting for someone to take the lead. All sound faded away, except for the whirring of a ceiling fan, making each tiny movement seem meaningful. With a steady voice and keeping his cool, Chris finally spoke up, breaking the heavy silence that had settled in the market. He looked right at Dolores and said, "Do you ever wonder what makes us hold on so tightly to our opinions? What do you think really changes when we treat each other like this?" His words were not sharp, but they hung in the air as something more than a simple question. It was almost like he was offering her a chance to think things over, not attacking, just opening the door to a different way of seeing the moment. There was a shift in the energy around them as some of the onlookers seemed to relax ever so slightly, maybe even relieved that the situation had not exploded. Chris stood tall but relaxed, his hands at his sides, showing he was not here to fight. But Dolores, still holding firm, drew herself up a little more. "I know exactly what I believe," she shot back, her tone cutting and loud enough for everyone to hear. "People these days are just too sensitive. Everything changes, and it's never for the better." Every word felt heavy, and the air buzzed again as her conviction overshadowed the aisle. The divide between them was now crystal clear, and you could almost feel the crowd soak up every part of the clash. Chris stood his ground, not letting Dolores's harsh reply push him back. Instead of firing back or raising his voice, he let the silence linger, giving everyone space to really feel the tension hanging in the air. The stillness coming from him was almost unsettling, and even those who had tried to act like they were busy with their shopping could not help but glance over. Somehow, his calmness demanded more attention than if he had yelled, and every pair of eyes in the aisle seemed locked on what would happen next. With slow, deliberate care, Chris set his shopping basket gently on the floor. He straightened his shoulders, looking even steadier, and took a deep breath. It was as if he was drawing on some quiet strength no one had noticed before. There was a respect in the way he carried himself, a kind of dignity that filled the gap left by the angry words. People watched his preparation, holding their own breath, half expecting a heated response but unsure what was coming. The whole store felt smaller, as if the walls had closed in just enough for every person to feel like they were standing right in the middle of something that mattered. In that moment, you could sense everyone waiting, curious, anxious, and a little bit hopeful. With a steady voice that carried through the quiet market, Chris started talking about his family. He spoke without any hint of anger, instead using slow and thoughtful words that seemed to sink deep into the space around him. "My grandparents came to New York with nothing but hope," he said, glancing at some familiar faces in the crowd. "They worked long nights in factories and cleaned office buildings that nobody else wanted to touch. My dad picked up every overtime shift he could just to keep food on our table. We were not rich, but we were proud to help build this city, little by little, job by job." As Chris continued, his words painted images of earlier days, long lines at the subway, cold mornings delivering newspapers before school, small victories that felt huge to his family. "We were not strangers here," he added, looking right. "At Dolores, we did our part, just like you and your parents did. Maybe our stories sound different, but we all want a good life for our kids." His story cut through the silence, and the crowd, even those who had tried to look away, listened closely. Chris's memories reached beyond that one moment, asking everyone to see the bigger picture, to remember how many families had made sacrifices so New York could be what it is now. As Chris kept speaking, the change in Dolores was slow at first, just a flicker in her eyes. The tension in her shoulders loosened, and the set lines on her face softened as something deeper began to settle in. She looked at Chris, and for maybe the first time, she was really seeing him. Not just as someone standing in front of her in a grocery store, but as a person shaped by his own battles and history. Even as she tried to keep her tough stance, there was a visible shift. Her arms dropped from their defensive crossing, and she pulled in a short, shaky breath. Everyone in the market was locked in, barely blinking, listening to Chris open up in a way that felt honest and raw. It was not just a story about struggle or blame. Instead, it sounded like an invitation to see another's side, to understand the heavy past everyone carries with them. Chris spoke of wanting a fair shot, of giving back to New York because it was their home too. That sincerity reached deep, and the crowd found themselves drawn closer, as if they were sharing something private and important. Chris's voice did not waver as he laid bare the quiet sacrifices that had allowed his family to stand in that very spot. Chris's voice carried a mix of confidence and openness, letting everyone hear the pain, but also the hope that had kept his family going through the toughest times. He did not just talk about the struggles, like being left out or getting overlooked for good jobs. He shared the dreams that got passed down each generation, and how his grandparents never let go of their sense of dignity, even when life in New York threw every kind of obstacle their way. Tales of never missing a day of work, of helping neighbors, even when they had little to give, brought a kind of quiet respect from the folks listening. Sometimes Chris's voice got stronger, almost like he was fighting back tears. Other times he spoke softer, steady, but worn down by memories. The story was not about blaming anyone. It was about opening up, inviting the people in that market to walk a mile in his shoes. You could feel how tired he was from carrying that history, but you could also see his hope that things would be better, not just for his family, but for everyone sharing the city. As he spoke, a hush fell over the whole store. People exchanged uncertain looks, some swallowing hard, as the weight of what Chris was saying pressed in on them. For the first time, many were thinking about the bigger story behind that morning's argument, wondering what else they might have missed just by staying quiet or not looking closer. Dolores, who had seemed so sure of herself earlier, now stood quietly, her hands fidgeting at her sides. She opened her mouth like she wanted to say something in response to Chris, but the right words refused to come. Each time she tried, her voice was smaller, barely above a whisper, and it never quite made it past the weight of what Chris had just shared. Her face flushed, not with anger this time, but with a kind of embarrassment, and her eyes darted downward, searching for something to focus on besides the gathering crowd. Chris did not push her for a reply. He just stood there, basket still at his feet, meeting Dolores's gaze with a steady kindness that made it clear he was not looking for a win, only understanding. Around them, the mood among the shoppers began to shift as well. Folks who had stopped to listen started quietly nodding, some even murmuring words of agreement with Chris's story. People who had never spoken to him before now sent him respectful looks, recognizing the honesty and heart he had laid open. For the first time that morning, there was a feeling in the air that something might actually change. Not just between Chris and Dolores, but in the bigger way, people saw each other in that busy New York market. Among the shoppers, an older man named Marcus finally found the nerve to speak up. He had been standing near the muffins, watching everything, and now stepped forward a bit, his face full of concern, but also determination. "You know, Chris is right," Marcus said, his voice steady though a little nervous. "My family's been here in New York for over 50 years, and we went through a lot of the same things. People forget those stories, or just choose not to listen. I'm glad someone's finally saying it." Marcus's words seemed to break the stiffness in the air. Others in the crowd began to chime in, some nodding, some even sharing their own small stories about the struggles and hopes they or their parents had brought to the city. An older woman near the produce section added that her folks had come from Georgia with nothing, and she recognized the feeling of needing to prove themselves over and over. The energy shifted for good. What had started as an argument and then a tense silence was now something warmer. People realized they were not alone in their feelings or memories. Instead of just quietly judging or looking away, they were opening up, offering Chris not only support, but a real sense of understanding. It was only a few minutes, but the connection felt real, reminding everyone that change often starts in the smallest, most ordinary moments. A woman named Angela, who had been watching the whole scene from the edge of the bakery line, spoke up next. Earlier, she had looked away, afraid to get involved. Now, something in Chris's words and the courage shown by those around her gave her the push to share. As well, "I just want to say thank you, Chris," Angela said, her voice steady but emotional. "It takes a lot to speak your truth out loud when it is easier to just let things go. Not everyone can do that. I think you reminded us all of something important today." Her acknowledgement was simple, but it meant a lot. It encouraged even more people to nod and quietly agree, making the moment feel even more real and communal. Angela's gratitude didn't just lift Chris up, it also highlighted how standing up against bias could be done with calmness and self-respect. Dolores, meanwhile, felt herself shrinking a little. The crowd's warmth toward Chris made her feel more alone, and the usual armor of pride she wore began to crack. She started to see past her own point of view, realizing that her words had left a mark, maybe in ways she had never intended. For the first time, Dolores found herself wondering about the impact of her actions and what her place was in this changing moment. Toward the front of the crowd, a young man named Brian stepped out from behind his shopping cart. He made his way right up to Chris, reaching out to shake his hand. "Thank you for saying what needed to be said," Brian told him plainly, not trying to make a big show of it. It was such a small gesture, but it seemed to stand for everything that moment meant to the people in that store. Brian did not let go of Chris's hand right away. The grip held a kind of respect that words could not always give. Watching Brian, others began to offer little signs of support too. Someone patted Chris gently on the shoulder as they passed by. Another customer gave a quiet smile or a few soft words. It was not loud or dramatic, but together those simple things built up, spreading through the crowd and tying everyone together for a brief moment. Even the cashier, who usually kept her head down and moved the line along, looked up and nodded at Chris, as if to let him know she had heard too. People who had started the morning as strangers now shared something real. The crowd seemed less scattered, more like a group that understood they could make a difference just by being decent to each other and choosing to care. Chris picked up his basket and started down the aisle again, but he walked a little slower than before. The conversation weighed on him, but there was something honest in the tired smile he gave to Marcus as he passed by. Chris knew what had happened was bigger than just an argument or a misunderstanding near the dairy section. He felt a mix of relief and accomplishment, as if, for once, all the unspoken struggles had finally found their way out into the open air. There was still a heaviness in his chest, but it carried hope now too. People watched Chris move through the store with a kind of quiet respect. Even those who had stayed out of it at first found themselves looking at him with new eyes. It was not just what he had said, but the calm way he had stood through it all, refusing to let anger take over. A couple of shoppers who had kept to the background nodded to Chris as if to say they understood something they had missed earlier. The store itself, usually buzzing with noise and chatter, felt changed. It was hushed, almost thoughtful, like everyone was walking out not only with groceries but also with a story they would be turning over in their minds for a long while. While waiting in line at the checkout, Angela found herself standing just behind Chris. She hesitated for a moment, rehearsing her words in her head, then leaned forward a little so he could hear her over the quiet beep of items being scanned. "Chris, I just want to say I really admire how you handled everything back there," she said. Her voice was almost gentle, but filled with real feeling. "It is not easy to keep your head when everything feels so tense, but the way you spoke, up without getting angry or shutting anyone out, it made a difference for a lot of us." Chris looked at her, surprised, and smiled. You could tell he was touched by her words, but he replied with a kind of simple honesty. "Thanks, Angela. The way I see it, real change comes when we actually talk to each other, even if it is hard. Hate never fixes anything, only makes it worse. If we want something to be different, we have got to meet it head on, but not let it change who we are." The line moved forward slowly, but for a few moments, the conversation between Chris and Angela brought a bit of lightness to the air. There was a quiet hope between them, as though maybe after everything, even small moments of respect could add up to something bigger than anyone expected. As Chris walked out of the supermarket, arms full with grocery bags, he noticed Dolores sitting alone in her car, not far from the exit. Her head was resting on the steering wheel, and even from a distance it was clear she was wrestling with her thoughts. For a brief moment, Chris considered going over, maybe saying a word or two to close out what had happened inside. But as he paused at the curb, he realized some things take more time than a single afternoon, and growth cannot be hurried by another person's kindness. Sometimes people need space to sit with what they have heard before they can move forward or make things right. Chris continued walking, the weight of the day settling in, but a sense of acceptance alongside it. The sun was dipping low behind the edge of the parking lot, casting long, deep shadows over the cracked pavement and turning everything golden. The world looked quieter now, as if holding its breath after all that had happened. Every step Chris took felt like moving towards something new, not just for him, but for Dolores too, and maybe even for a few others who had witnessed the day's events unfold in that ordinary New York grocery store. Later that evening, Chris sat around the small kitchen table with his uncle Frank. Frank had always been the steady presence in Chris's life, the kind of man who said little, but somehow always knew what to say. Chris talked about what had happened at the grocery store, sharing every detail from Angela's words to the way people had reacted to Dolores. He admitted he felt both proud and unsure, wondering if anything he did really made a lasting difference. Frank listened in his usual calm way, nodding slowly as Chris spoke. Then he leaned back, looked Chris in the eye and said, "You know, sometimes the only thing we can do is put a seed down in the dirt. Whether or not it grows, that is not always Up to us. But if nobody ever tries, nothing changes. It was simple, and Chris felt the weight of it. The truth in the idea that change takes time, and sometimes just beginning is enough. That advice washed over Chris, giving him a sense of peace he had not felt all day. Even if he did not have all the answers or see immediate results, it was clear that facing ignorance head-on was worth something. It meant refusing to let fear or silence win. At home that night, Dolores sat alone in her small kitchen, staring down at her dinner. The food had grown cold, untouched, while her thoughts kept returning to the words Chris had spoken in the store. She kept replaying everything in her mind, the way he had stayed calm when things got tense, how the people around them had actually listened. For so many years, Dolores had held tight to her opinions, never really questioning where they came from or if they were all that solid. Now, for the first time, she found herself doubting what used to feel certain. It was uncomfortable to sit with these questions, and even a bit frightening. She thought about her family, especially her grandchildren, and the kind of country she hoped they would grow up in. Would they become people who made space for others, or would they hold on to old fears just because it felt safer? The day's events had cracked something open in Dolores, even if she could not quite admit it out loud yet. As she pushed her plate away, she did not feel angry anymore, just quiet and a little sad, but mixed with something that felt almost like hope. For the first time in a long while, change did not seem so impossible. Over the next few days, word of what happened at the grocery store on Houston Street began to spread all over the Lower East Side. People talked about it at coffee shops, on the subway, and even in line at the neighborhood deli. It seemed like everyone had heard about Chris, the quiet way he stood his ground, and how the mood in the store shifted because of his example. Some folks only knew pieces of the story, but most agreed on one thing. Respect and courage had shown up that afternoon, and it made people think about how they treated each other. Teachers brought up the story in classrooms to talk about empathy and what it means to do the right thing when no one expects you to. A couple of parents shared it with their kids to show that even everyday moments can matter. Chris's name popped up in local online groups, and people started using the incident as proof that speaking up peacefully actually could make a difference. Little by little, the community's views began to change. Facing prejudice head-on started to feel possible, less like a lost cause, and more like a responsibility. Long after that day, the lesson lingered. Simple acts of kindness and guts had the power to shape the neighborhood for the better.